Okay, we are going to start our first dialogue, and this is called the Euthyphro, and it is written by Plato. But the thing about Plato, this can get a little bit confusing, is that he had a teacher, and his teacher's name was Socrates. And you may have heard of these names before. And so Plato was Socrates' student. Now, the deal is Socrates wrote nothing down. He believed, and he explained in one of the dialogues, that if you write things down, it makes people lazy, basically, because you don't remember things, and so they're not in your soul. So the idea is, if you have to go to an external source for information, then it's really not yours. So he didn't write anything down. Plato, on the other hand, did. Plato wrote all sorts of things in which his teacher, Socrates, is kind of the star. And what Plato wrote, largely, was dialogues. And the dia, comes from the word for two. And a dialogue is a conversation, obviously, right? But the idea is sort of like this. You take a thesis or an idea, right? And then you take an antithesis or an antithesis, which is an opposite idea. You put them together, and then you get a synthesis or a new idea, if that makes sense. So in other words, in a dialogue, speaker one has this idea, speaker two has this idea, and together they come up with an improved truth. This is the whole point of dialogue. And Plato wrote in dialogues because he wanted to draw the reader in to this kind of concept. And it can be obviously a very valuable and powerful tool. Now, one of the difficulties, well, there's two difficulties. One is interpretation, right? There are any number of ways that you can interpret, especially Plato's dialogues. Plato wrote in a way that was a little bit ambiguous on purpose, to leave room for interpretation. But then there's also issues of translation. So in other words, anytime anybody says to you, Plato said that, or if you look up, quotes.com and there's a quote from Plato, you always have to be highly suspect because of interpretation and translation. It takes a lot of work, in other words, to be able to say Plato said X. So what we're going to talk about today a little bit before we dive into the dialogues is some of the issues of translation. So I have a few examples of translation. Now remember that this was written in ancient Greek, right? Remember that. And ancient Greek is a language that does not share the same alphabet with us or anything. And ancient Greek is different than modern Greek. So this is a language long dead. So when we read our dialogues, remember we're reading them in translated modern English versions. American English at that, right? We're not reading British English. But here's a couple translations. First of all, nope, not that one, sorry. This is from the classics department at MIT, and it's available online for free. So here is, the title, obviously. Oh, and the titles of Platonic dialogues are usually taken from the guy Socrates is talking to. So in other words, Euthyphro is a guy's name. So here it tells you the translator is Benjamin Jowett. This is an industry standard, which is why it's free. Jowett translated this, I think it was like at the end of the 19th century. And so this is very common, very standard. Okay, so notice here, right, you have the people in the dialogue, Socrates and Euthyphro. The scene, in other words, where it happens. It's not a play per se, but these do happen somewhere, and there's some kind of context. The porch of the King Archon, and then the dialogue starts. Euthyphro, Socrates, youth, soc, etc. Okay. Here's another version. This is from Perseus at Tufts University. Again, this is an open source. This one, can I move this over a tad? Yeah. This one, notice, this is the one that we're going to use when I start talking, when we start workshopping the dialogue. I'm going to use it because I can fit everything in on the screen. So I need that. But notice how it's sectioned here, right? 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, etc. Let me jump ahead and show you what that means. Here's an example of my text. I'm old school. I like to have books, but in an online course, if you can get free online sources, why not, right? But in the last one that we saw from the Perseus project, remember it had those numbers and letters? So here, this is 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, 3, etc. And these numbers, these marginal notes, if you're used to having had read, Shakespeare or the Bible or anything, there's always a way in which they number the lines, right? And that's just to make things easier, because when you're dealing with translations, they're not all going to be the same. And so it's not going to be the same page number based on additions and stuff. So to deal with pages and paragraphs is very cumbersome and changes from version to version. So a guy in the 1500s came up with a system which is now called Stephanos notes. And all of Plato's dialogues are divided by Stephanos notes, because Plato didn't have the conventions of the English language in terms of sentences and paragraphs and sections and all that kind of stuff. So oftentimes these dialogues will be not oftentimes. Plato wrote them without a thought to 2018 Americans, and so translators go back and add them, but some don't. For instance, okay, so this is the Tufts one, and it's sectioned out, right? So there's 2A, 2B, 2C, etc. You get the point. But then some don't do it at all. Like here's one. Look at this. This comes from Indiana University, and this one has no Stephanos notes. Also, the first one I showed you, no Stephanos notes. So the trick can be, especially now, if you just want to read it on your own, just because you don't necessarily need the Stephanos notes. But if we're going to talk about it together, we need to be able to draw our attention to certain lines. That's why I'm going to choose this guy for our class. Okay, so now you understand hopefully a little bit about how they're put together. The next thing I want to bring to your attention is the differences of translation itself. Okay, for example, let's look at 2A in this Tufts edition. Now, we should note who is the translator here. If you look down here, here's our reference, right? So Plato, 12 volumes, Harold North Fowler. Okay, this is the Fowler editions from Harvard, and again, industry standards. Okay, so let's look at the opening line. Euthyphro says, "What strange thing has happened, Socrates, that you have left your accustomed haunts in the Lyceum and are now haunting the portico where the king Archon sits? For it cannot be that you have an action before the king as I have." Okay, so that's Fowler's translation of the ancient Greek. And the thing is, of course, right, any translation is always an active interpretation, because you have to make choices for your audience. Basically, most fundamentally for a translator, your choice is, one, I am going to make this as accessible to the language of the people reading it I can. Or two, I'm going to keep it as faithful to the original as I can. And those are your two choices. And that's why, sometimes, especially for beginners, they would gravitate towards translations that sound more familiar and in the style of their own current syntactical and linguistic conventions, right? But those can sometimes be a little far removed from meaning. As an example, have you ever read those updated Shakespeares, right? Like when you read Shakespeare in the original, you're like, good Lord, it's so cumbersome and you have to look up every third word, right? Or you can read these translations that are updated and it makes more sense. But you're losing a lot when they update these translations. So anyway, for sake of argument, let's look at a couple other examples. So that's the first line from the Fowler edition. Here's the Jowett edition. Euthyphro says, "Why have you left the Lyceum, Socrates? And what are you doing in the porch of the king Archon? Surely you cannot be concerned in a suit before the king like myself." Notice it's a little bit different, right? I mean, not significantly, I don't think, but it is syntactically different, but we get the same meaning, right? And then we could go to something like this one. "What has happened, Socrates, to make you leave your accustomed pastimes at the Lyceum and spend your time here today at the king's porch? You can hardly have a suit pending before the king as I do." A couple things jump out at you, right? Notice he said the king's porch. Remember the other one said archon? The Greek term was archon, not king. But, most contemporary audiences wouldn't know what the heck an archon is, right? So notice this guy has chosen to just go ahead and say king because the archon was not a king, but good enough for beginners to understand it that way so they have something to grasp on, right? Here's the one that I was using in my text. Euthyphro says, "What's new, Socrates, to make you leave your usual haunts in the Lyceum and spend your time here at the King Archon's court? Surely you're not prosecuting anyone before the King Archon as I am." And so now we get Socrates haunting this time, right? So notice each one is a little bit different in terms of style. And sometimes those differences, however, can be significant if they change the connotation, right? So if you say, someone is hanging around versus someone is haunting an area, I mean, those choices that a translator makes can make all the difference. Now, one other thing I wanted to make you aware of is this. Sparknotes. I don't exactly, condone this. However, if you do go to sparknotes.com, it's annoying because of all the ads, but it's free. But if you go to these summaries, right, they have, I've looked up Euthyphro, obviously, and then you go down to summary, and then you go by section, and you get these little summaries here that tell you basically the plot and the very basic logic. And so it's condensed. It's written in a way that would be much easier for us to read. So when we're looking at these translations, this is the one that we're going to use for our purposes as we move forward. But I wanted to make you aware of the fact that, one needs to appreciate as an educated person that, the vast majority of the things that you come across are translated, right? And those translations bring with them differences that can sometimes be significant. And so we have to always be aware of that. But also, a couple challenges are going to be for us in these dialogues moving forward, especially with Plato, is that we've got to keep almost two balls in the air, right? Because we have to understand that any particular line we pull out is not necessarily what Socrates said. He could be paraphrasing what somebody else said. So dialogues are difficult to study sometimes. But so what I would suggest is, 1, read a summary first. Get a sense of it. 2, then go back and we'll dialogue it together. We'll workshop it together.